The wind howled through the canyons of Chicago's downtown, a biting November gust that cut through Clara Thompson's threadbare jacket as she huddled in the shadow of a shuttered storefront on Michigan Avenue. At 9 years old, Clara was a ghost in the city's pulse. Her small frame swallowed by the oversized hoodie she'd scavenged from a dumpster behind a thrift store. Her shoes, once white sneakers, were now a patchwork of holes and duct tape, the soles flapping with every step. In her arms she clutched a tattered backpack, its straps frayed to threads, holding everything she owned. A half-eaten apple, a dog-eared notebook filled with scribbled musical notes, and a chipped plastic comb she used to pretend was a bow for an imaginary cello. The streets of Chicago were her home now, a labyrinth of concrete and neon where she'd learned to move unseen, dodging the eyes of cops, shopkeepers, and do-gooders who might drag her back to the orphanage she'd fled a year ago. Clara's dark brown eyes, too big for her gaunt face, flickered with a stubborn spark as she watched the glittering lights of the Grand Sterling Hotel across the street, its marble facade glowing like a beacon of a world she'd once known. Clara's memories of that world were fragmented like a melody half-remembered. She saw flashes of her father, Daniel Thompson, his long fingers dancing across the strings of his cello, filling their cozy Evanston home with music that felt like sunlight. Daniel had been a legend, a cellist whose performances at Symphony Center had left audiences weeping, his name whispered in the same breath as Yo-Yo Ma. Clara remembered sitting on his lap at 4 years old, her tiny hands guided by his as they played simple scales on his prized Stradivarius. "This is our language, Clara," he'd say, his voice warm as the wood of the instrument. "The cello speaks what words can't." But that was before the train crash 4 years ago, when Daniel's life ended on a snowy track outside Milwaukee, leaving Clara alone. Her mother, Emily, had died of heart disease when Clara was 3, and with no other family, the system swallowed her. The orphanage in Cicero was a gray, joyless place where the staff dismissed her stories of her father as the fantasies of a grieving child. A cellist's daughter. Sure kid, they'd scoff, their voices dripping with pity. The fire that destroyed the city's records 2 years ago erased any proof of who she was, and Clara became just another number in a file, a girl with no past. She'd run away at 8, unable to bear the silence of a world without music. The orphanage had no instruments, no radios, just the drone of fluorescent lights and the shouts of other kids. Clara escaped 4 times, caught 3, but on the 4th, she vanished into Chicago's underbelly. She learned to sleep in subway stations when the cold bit too hard to beg outside churches on Sundays, to scavenge leftovers from the alleys behind restaurants in Wicker Park. But the music never left her. At night, when the city quieted, she'd close her eyes and play her father's pieces in her mind, her fingers twitching against the air, tracing the notes of Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. Sometimes she'd sneak into music stores in the Loop, hovering near the string section, her hands itching to touch the cellos she could never afford. Once a clerk caught her pretending to play an invisible bow on a display model and chased her out, yelling, "This ain't a playground, kid." But Clara didn't care. The music was her anchor, the one thing the streets couldn't take. Tonight, hunger gnawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, the apple in her bag too precious to finish. The Grand Sterling Hotel loomed across the street, its windows spilling golden light onto the sidewalk. Clara had overheard 2 buskers talking about a charity gala happening there, a glitzy event to raise money for disadvantaged kids. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was the kind of kid they were supposedly helping, but no one would see her as anything but a street rat. Still, the promise of food drew her closer. Maybe she could slip into the kitchen, grab a roll or some scraps before anyone noticed. She adjusted her backpack, pulled her hood low, and darted across the street, weaving through honking cabs and pedestrians in fur coats. The doorman, a burly man in a red uniform, eyed her suspiciously as she approached, but Clara was quick. She ducked under his arm and slipped through the revolving doors, her heart pounding like a metronome set to presto. Inside the Grand Sterling was a world of opulence Clara could barely comprehend. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting prisms across the marble floor. Men in tuxedos and women in sequined gowns glided through the lobby, their laughter sharp and foreign. The air smelled of perfume and roasted meat, making Clara's stomach twist with longing. She kept her head down, moving toward the grand ballroom where the gala was in full swing. The double doors were ajar, and through them she saw a cello, a Stradivarius perched on a small stage in the center of the room. Its polished wood gleamed under the spotlight, its curves as familiar as her father's smile. It was identical to the one he'd played, the one she'd touched as a child, its strings singing under his hands. Clara froze her breath, catching. For a moment, she was 5 again, sitting in their living room, watching Daniel practice the world fading away until it was just them and the music. The crowd's chatter snapped her back. A woman in a sapphire dress wrinkled her nose as she passed, muttering, "Who let her in?" Clara's cheeks burned, but she couldn't tear her eyes from the cello. She edged closer, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor. The security guards, 2 men in black suits, were already moving toward her, their radios crackling. Clara's heart raced. She knew she had seconds before they grabbed her, before she was back on the street hungry and cold. But the cello called to her a pull stronger than fear. She stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling, and faced the crowd. The room fell quiet, eyes turning to the ragged girl who didn't belong. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. "Can I play something? For some food?" Laughter erupted sharp and cruel. A man in a bow tie snorted, "What's this a street kid thinks she's Yo-Yo Ma?" A woman with diamond earrings giggled, covering her mouth. Clara's face flushed, but she didn't back down. Her eyes locked on the cello, her only friend in this room of strangers. The event organizer, a wiry man named Victor Hayes, raised a hand to silence the guards. His smirk was cold, but his curiosity won out. "All right, kid," he said, his voice booming through the microphone. "Let's see what you've got. But if it's just noise, you're out." The crowd chuckled, settling into their seats, ready for a spectacle. Clara approached the cello, her hands shaking as she lifted it from its stand. It was heavier than she remembered, but the weight felt right, like coming home. She sat on the edge of the stage, the cold wood of the chair grounding her. Her fingers, dirty and calloused, brushed the strings, and a single note rang out, pure and clear. The laughter stopped. Clara closed her eyes, shutting out the sea of skeptical faces, and began to play Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. The prelude's opening notes flowed from her fingers, each one precise, resonant, alive. The music wasn't just sound. It was her father's laughter, her mother's lullabies, the warmth of a home she'd lost. The crowd's murmurs faded as Clara leaned into the piece, her small body swaying with the rhythm, her bow drawing out notes that seemed to shimmer in the air. The technical passages, fiendishly difficult even for professionals, were flawless, but it was the emotion that gripped the room, a raw, aching beauty that spoke of loss and survival. When the final note faded, the ballroom was silent. Clara opened her eyes, her chest heaving, expecting to be dragged away. Instead, a single clap broke the stillness, then another, until the room exploded in applause. Faces that had mocked her now stared in awe. Clara's knees buckled, but she stayed upright, clutching the cello like a lifeline. In the back of the room, Sarah Coleman, a music critic for the Chicago Tribune, stood frozen. She'd known Daniel Thompson for 20 years, had reviewed his concerts, shared dinners with him and his wife. The way Clara's bow moved, the delicate vibrato, the fierce passion, it was Daniel's playing reborn in this child. Sarah's eyes welled up as she pushed through the crowd, her mind racing. Could this girl, this street urchin, be Daniel's daughter, the one everyone thought had died with him? As the applause thundered on, Clara stood alone on the stage, unaware that her life was about to change, that the music she'd carried through the streets had just opened a door to a past she'd thought was gone forever. The morning after Clara Thompson's astonishing performance at the Grand Sterling Hotel, the grand ballroom's opulence felt like a distant dream. Clara sat on a plush couch in Sarah Coleman's Lakeview apartment, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that steamed in the chilly November air, filtering through an open window. The apartment was a cozy contrast to the streets she'd roamed for the past year. Bookshelves stuffed with music theory texts, a turntable spinning a soft Vivaldi concerto, and framed posters of Chicago Symphony Orchestra performances lining the walls. Clara's tattered backpack rested against the couch, its contents spilling slightly, the chipped comb, the half-eaten apple now browning, and the notebook of scribbled notes that had been her only connection to her father's music. She wore a clean sweater and jeans Sarah had found in a spare closet, but the clothes hung loosely on her frame, her thinness a stark reminder of the hunger she'd endured. Clara's dark eyes darted around the room, wary like a stray cat, unsure if it was safe to stay. Sarah, a wiry woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp green eyes, sat across from her, a notebook open on her lap. The music critic's mind was still reeling from the night before, from the impossible sight of a street child playing Bach, with the soul of Daniel Thompson, her friend, and the greatest cellist she'd ever known. Sarah had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by Clara's performance. She'd seen Daniel play that same cello suite number 1 countless times, his bow drawing out notes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Clara's technique, her precise fingering, the way she leaned into the phrases with a mix of tenderness and fire, was a mirror of his. But it wasn't just the technique. It was the way Clara's face softened during the slower passages, her eyes half closed, as if she were speaking to someone no one else could see. Sarah had known Daniel's daughter Clara as a toddler, a bright-eyed girl who'd clapped gleefully at her father's rehearsals. Everyone thought Clara had died with Daniel in that train crash 4 years ago. The wreckage so catastrophic that identification had been a nightmare. The news had reported no survivors, and Sarah had mourned them both at a memorial service, clutching a program from Daniel's last concert. Yet, here was this girl, dirty and underfed, playing with a mastery that couldn't be by coincidence. Sarah's journalist instincts kicked in, but so did something deeper, a need to protect this child who'd somehow survived. "Clara," Sarah said gently, setting her notebook aside, "can you tell me about your dad?" Clara's fingers tightened around the mug, her knuckles whitening. She hadn't spoken about Daniel in years, not since the orphanage workers dismissed her stories as delusions. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the hum of the radiator. "He played the cello. He was the best. He taught me to play when I was little before." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, her dark hair falling over her face. "Before the train. He said music was how we talked to the stars." Sarah's chest tightened. She remembered Daniel saying something similar once over coffee after a rehearsal, his eyes bright with passion. "And your mom?" Sarah pressed, careful not to push too hard. Clara's shoulders hunched. "She got sick. her heart. I was 3. Then it was just me and Dad until… She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah stood crossing to a shelf where she kept a box of old keepsakes. She pulled out a photograph, faded but clear, Daniel mid-performance, his cello gleaming under stage lights, a young Clara in a frilly dress clapping from the front row. "Is this him?" Sarah asked, holding it out. Clara's breath hitched. She reached for the photo, her fingers trembling, and nodded. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her jaw tight. "That's Dad. That was…" me. Sarah sat beside her, keeping her voice steady. "Clara, I knew your father. He was my friend. I think you're his daughter, but we need to be sure. Can you tell me more? Anything specific about him, about your life before Clara's story came in fragments like a melody pieced together, note by note." She remembered their Evanston home, a cozy brownstone with a music room where Daniel's Stradivarius lived, its wood polished to a warm glow. She recalled evenings when he'd play for her, teaching her scales, laughing when her small hands fumbled. The night of the crash, he'd been traveling to a concert in Milwaukee. Clara was supposed to stay with a neighbor, but they'd had a fight, and Daniel, unable to find a last-minute sitter, took her along. He promised we'd get ice cream after Clara whispered, her voice thick. We were singing in the train car some silly song he made up. Then, everything went dark. She woke in a hospital, bandaged, and alone, her father gone. The social workers couldn't find her records, and when she told them who she was, they didn't believe her. They said I was making it up, that I was just some kid. Then the fire happened and they stopped asking. Sarah's heart sank. She knew about the fire ablaze that gutted a Chicago municipal archive 2 years ago, destroying birth certificates, adoption records, and more. It explained why Clara had slipped through the cracks, why a child of a musical legend had been left to fend for herself. But Sarah needed proof, something undeniable. "Clara," she said, "did your dad ever play something just for you? A piece no one else knew?" Clara's eyes lit up, a flicker of the girl she'd been. "Yeah, Lullaby for Dawn. He wrote it for Mom when I was born. He'd play it when I couldn't sleep." Sarah's pulse quickened. She'd heard that piece once at Daniel's home, a haunting melody never performed publicly, recorded only on a private tape she'd kept after his death. "Can you play it?" she asked. Sarah led Clara to a small music room where a modest cello rested, a loaner from a colleague. Clara hesitated, then picked up the instrument, her movements reverent. She closed her eyes, and the first notes of Lullaby for Dawn filled the room. Soft aching, a melody that wove love and loss into every phrase. Sarah's breath caught. It was unmistakably Daniel's, down to the subtle pauses he'd used to mimic a heartbeat. When Clara finished, tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. Sarah knelt beside her, her own eyes wet. "That's it," she whispered. "That's his song. Clara, you're his daughter." Clara's shoulders shook, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry, the weight of her loneliness pouring out. Sarah wasted no time. She called a lawyer friend, Margaret Weiss, who specialized in estates and had handled Daniel's affairs after his death. His will had left everything: his penthouse, his instruments, a trust fund worth millions in limbo, awaiting any heirs. The train crash's chaos had led authorities to assume Clara perished, and with no other family, the estate was frozen. Sarah explained Clara's story: the fire, the performance, the lullaby. Margaret was skeptical, but agreed to start the process of verification, beginning with a DNA test. Sarah also contacted a colleague at the Chicago Tribune's archives, digging for any surviving records of Daniel's life. She found a single document, A hospital birth record for Clara miraculously spared from the fire listing Daniel and Emily as parents. It wasn't enough on its own, but combined with the DNA test and the lullaby it could be. While the legal wheels turned, Sarah focused on Clara. The girl was skittish, flinching at loud noises, hoarding food under her pillow, as if expecting to be thrown back to the streets. Sarah enrolled her in therapy with a gentle psychologist who specialized in trauma, and slowly Clara began to trust. Sarah also reached out to Mikhail Ivanov, a legendary cello teacher who'd retired from the Juilliard School but still lived in Chicago. Mikhail, a gruff Russian with a reputation for turning away students, agreed to meet Clara after Sarah sent him a shaky phone video of her playing at the gala. When he arrived at the apartment, his white hair wild and his eyes piercing, Clara shrank back, but Mikhail sat at the cello, played a single phrase from Dvorak, and handed her the bow. "Show me," he said. Clara played, her nerves fading as the music took over. Mikhail's stern face softened. "She's raw," he told Sarah later, "but she has a soul. I'll teach her." Clara's first lesson with Mikhail was daunting. He was exacting, correcting her posture, her bow hold, her phrasing. "You play like a street busker," he said, not unkindly. "We start from the ground up." Clara, used to playing for herself, bristled but obeyed. She wanted to honor her father's music, to prove she was more than a charity case. Sarah watched from the doorway, marveling at Clara's determination. The girl practiced for hours, her fingers blistering, her eyes fierce, but performing in front of others terrified her. The gala had been a fluke driven by hunger and desperation. Sarah suggested a small recital at her apartment, just for a few friends. Clara agreed reluctantly, her hands shaking as she set up the cello. The audience, 5 of Sarah's music colleagues, sat expectantly. Clara froze her bow, hovering over the strings. Sarah touched her shoulder. "Play for your dad," she whispered. Clara nodded, closed her eyes, and began Lullaby for Dawn. The room vanished, and it was just her and the music, her father's presence alive in every note. When she finished, the small crowd was silent, then erupted in applause. Clara smiled a real smile for the first time in years. By the end of the month, the DNA results confirmed what Sarah already knew: Clara was Daniel Thompson's daughter. Margaret filed papers to release the estate, including the penthouse in River North Daniel's Stradivarius and the trust fund. Clara would never go hungry again. But as Sarah watched her sleep that night, curled up on the couch, with the cello case nearby, she knew the real work was just beginning. Clara wasn't just a prodigy, she was a child who'd survived unimaginable loss. Restoring her identity was only the first step. Teaching her to trust, to dream, to live again, that would take time, love, and music. Sarah closed her notebook, the pages filled with plans for Clara's future, and whispered to herself, "We'll get there, kid. One note at a time." 3 years had passed since Clara Thompson's life-changing night at the Grand Sterling Hotel, and at 12 years old, she stood on the cusp of something extraordinary. The River North penthouse she'd inherited from her father, Daniel Thompson, was now her home, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline. The walls were lined with framed concert posters from Daniel's career, and in the center of the living room sat his Stradivarius cello, its polished wood catching the morning light. Clara, no longer the gaunt street child, had grown into a wiry girl with a cascade of dark curls and eyes that held both fire and fragility. She wore a simple navy dress, her fingers calloused from hours of practice under Mikhail Ivanov's unrelenting tutelage. The world was beginning to know her name not just as Daniel's daughter, but as a prodigy in her own right. Yet, as she stood before a mirror, preparing for her first major public recital at the Chicago Cultural Center, Clara felt the weight of eyes on her, not all of them kind. The media had dubbed her the street cellist, a moniker that both celebrated her talent and reminded her of the years she'd spent invisible scraping by on Chicago's streets. Clara's journey since that gala night had been a whirlwind. Sarah Coleman, her guardian and fiercest advocate, had shielded her from the worst of the public's curiosity. But the story of a homeless girl turned musical prodigy was catnip for the press. Tabloids speculated about her past, some calling her a fraud, others a miracle. Social media buzzed with clips of her playing the grainy gala video, racking up millions of views. Clara hated the attention the way strangers stared when she and Sarah walked through Millennium Park. "They don't see me," she told Mikhail during a lesson, her voice tight. "They see a story." Mikhail, his white hair wilder than ever, leaned forward, his Russian accent thick. "Then make them see you, Clara. Play. So they forget the headlines and hear your soul." His words stuck with her, a challenge she carried into every practice, every performance. She was determined to be more than a sob story to prove she was her father's daughter, not just in blood, but in artistry. Clara's music was evolving, a blend of the classical precision Daniel had taught her and something new born from the streets. She'd spent hours listening to buskers in the loop, jazz saxophonists, blues guitarists, drummers pounding on plastic buckets. Their raw energy seeped into her playing, giving her Bach a swing, her Dvorak a pulse. One night, unable to sleep, she'd sat at her father's cello and improvised, weaving classical motifs with the syncopated rhythms she'd heard outside jazz clubs. The result was Streets of Resilience, a suite that told her story, the cold of subway stations, the hope of a single note, the triumph of surviving. When she played it for Mikhail, he was silent for a long moment, then said, "This is yours, Clara, not your father's, yours." The piece became her signature, a bridge between the concert hall and the alleyways she'd once called home. Tonight's recital was a fundraiser for a cause Clara had chosen herself: music programs for Chicago's underserved kids. Sarah had organized it, renting the Cultural Center's Tiffany-domed hall and inviting donors, musicians, and community leaders. Clara had insisted the event be free for kids from shelters and foster homes, wanting them to see what she'd become. Backstage, her stomach churned as she peeked through the curtain at the growing crowd. The dome's stained glass glowed above, casting colors across the faces of men in suits, women in evening gowns, and a cluster of wide-eyed children in mismatched clothes. Clara's hands shook as she tuned her cello, the Stradivarius her father had played, now hers. Sarah, in a sleek black blazer, squeezed her shoulder. "You've got this," she said. "Play for them, but mostly for you." Clara nodded, swallowing her fear. She'd faced worse than a crowd hunger-cold, the loneliness of the streets. This was just another step. The lights dimmed, and Clara stepped onto the stage, the cello's weight steadying her. The audience hushed their eyes, a mix of curiosity and expectation. She began with Bach's Cello Suite No. 1, the piece that had changed her life, its notes flowing with a confidence she hadn't felt 3 years ago. The crowd leaned forward, captivated by the clarity, the emotion. Then came Streets of Resilience. Clara closed her eyes, letting the music carry her back to the streets. The clatter of the L train, the laughter of buskers, the ache of an empty stomach. The suite's first movement was slow, mournful, a lament for her lost family. The second burst with jazz-infused energy, mimicking the chaos of the city. The final movement soared, a hymn to survival, its final note ringing out like a promise. When she finished, the hall was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause. Clara opened her eyes, startled to see tears on faces in the front row, even among the kids who'd likely never heard classical music before. The recital raised over $1 million, enough to fund music classes in 10 community centers across Chicago's south and west sides. Clara visited the first center a week later, a converted warehouse in Englewood, where kids her age and younger sat in a circle clutching borrowed violins and cellos. She played for them, not Bach, but a jazzy riff she'd improvised, grinning as they clapped along. One boy, a skinny 11-year-old named Jamal, stayed after staring at her cello. "You really lived on the street?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Clara nodded, showing him the calluses on her hands. "Music kept me going," she said. "It can do the same for you." She handed him her bow, letting him try a note. His face lit up as the sound filled the room, and Clara felt a spark of purpose. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. That moment inspired the Daniel Thompson Music Academy, Clara's dream to give kids like Jamal a chance. Sarah and Margaret the lawyer helped her set it up, using part of her father's trust fund to buy a building in Pilsen, a vibrant neighborhood of murals and taquerias. The academy offered free lessons to kids from shelters, foster homes, and low-income families, with instruments donated by Chicago's music community. Clara scoured the city for students visiting homeless shelters and community centers, listening for that spark she'd felt in herself. She found it in kids like Rosa, a shy girl who'd taught herself guitar on a broken instrument, and Malik, a foster kid who banged rhythms on tabletops. Mikhail agreed to consult, grumbling but secretly proud, and hired young teachers who'd grown up in similar neighborhoods. Clara taught, too, her classes a mix of classical technique and improvisation, encouraging students to tell their own stories through music. The Academy's first year was chaotic: broken strings, missed lessons, kids too shy or angry to try. But Clara was patient, remembering her own fear. She'd sit with students, sharing stories of her street days, showing them her old notebook of scribbled notes. "This was my cello. When I had nothing," she'd say, holding it up. Slowly, the kids opened up their music, raw but honest. The Academy's first recital, held in the Pilsen building's tiny auditorium, was a triumph. Rosa played a haunting original piece, Malik led a drum circle that had the crowd dancing, and Jamal, now a beginner cellist, played a shaky but proud version of Twinkle Twinkle. Clara watched from the back, tears in her eyes, knowing this was what her father would have wanted. Clara's own fame grew, but she struggled with its weight. Critics praised her, but some dismissed her as a novelty, a street kid with a cello. At a music festival in Grant Park, a reviewer whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "She's good, but can a 12-year-old really understand music's depth?" Clara burned with anger, but channeled it into her next composition. City Pulse, a fierce piece that blended Shostakovich's intensity with Chicago's street sounds. She performed it at the festival's closing, silencing doubters with a performance so raw it left the crowd breathless. Mikhail, watching from the wings, gave her a rare nod. "Now they see you," he said. The chapter closed with Clara's return to the Cicero orphanage, a place she'd sworn never to revisit. Sarah drove her, sensing her tension. The gray building looked smaller now, its peeling paint and barred windows less intimidating. Clara brought her cello, setting up in the common room where kids sat on plastic chairs, their eyes wary. She didn't play her father's music or her own compositions. Instead, she played a medley of pop songs she'd heard on the streets, inviting the kids to sing along. Slowly, they did, their voices hesitant, but growing bolder. Afterward, a girl with braids asked, "Can I learn?" That Clara smiled, handing her a flyer for the Academy. "You can learn anything," she said. Driving back to the penthouse, Clara stared out the window, the city lights blurring. She was no longer the girl who'd run from this place. She was building something new, note by note, for herself and for kids like her, proving that music could be a home when all else was lost. At 25, Clara Thompson stood at the pinnacle of her musical career, a name synonymous with brilliance and resilience. The Chicago skyline sparkled beyond the windows of her River North penthouse, where she now lived, surrounded by echoes of her father, Daniel Thompson, the legendary cellist whose Stradivarius rested proudly in her studio. Clara's dark curls were swept into a loose bun, her hands steady as she tuned the instrument, her calluses a testament to years of practice and passion. She was no longer the frightened 9-year-old who'd played for a sandwich at the Grand Sterling Hotel 16 years ago. Now she was a global icon, her performances selling out Carnegie Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Sydney Opera House. Her compositions, blending classical elegance with the raw pulse of Chicago's streets, had redefined the cello's voice for a new generation. Yet, as she prepared for her most ambitious project, a worldwide streamed concert connecting thousands of young musicians, Clara felt the weight of her journey not as a burden, but as a beacon. The Daniel Thompson Music Academy, her brainchild, had grown from a single Pilsen storefront into a network of schools across 20 countries offering free music education to kids from shelters, foster homes, and forgotten corners of the world. Tonight's concert, broadcast live from Chicago's Symphony Center, would be a celebration of that mission, a testament to music's power to heal and uplift. Clara's life was a balancing act. Fame brought adulation, standing ovations, glowing reviews, invitations to perform for presidents and queens, but it also brought pressure. Critics dissected her every note, some still whispering that her story, not her talent, fueled her success. Social media was a mixed bag. Fans shared videos of her playing Streets of Resilience, but trolls mocked her street kid origins. Clara had learned to tune out the noise, focusing instead on her students. The academy was her heart, a place where kids like Jamal, now a rising cellist at Juilliard, and Rosa, who'd started her own band, had found their voices. Clara spent mornings teaching, afternoons composing, and evenings managing the academy's expansion, often collapsing into bed past midnight. Sarah Coleman, now 65 and semi-retired from music criticism, remained her manager and surrogate mother, her sharp wit tempered by a warmth that anchored Clara. Mikhail Ivanov, at 82, had stepped back from teaching, but still sent her gruff emails with advice. "Don't let the world make you soft, Clara. Play with fire." Their guidance kept her grounded, but the real fuel was her students' progress, their stories mirroring her own. The concert, titled Harmony in Hope, was Clara's boldest vision yet. It would feature performances by Academy students in 60 cities from Chicago to Nairobi, Mumbai to Sao Paulo, all linked via live stream. Clara had spent months planning, coordinating with teachers, tech crews, and donors. The Chicago performance would be the centerpiece, with Clara playing alongside her students in a new composition, Dreams Over the Horizon, a piece she'd written to honor her father and the kids she'd vowed to help. The piece wove classical motifs with global rhythms, African drums, Indian ragas, Brazilian samba, reflecting the Academy's diverse community. Clara had also invited guest artists, a jazz trumpeter from New Orleans, a sitarist from Delhi, and a choir of refugee children from London. The event wasn't just a concert, it was a statement. Clara wanted the world to see what music could do, how it could give voice to the voiceless, just as it had for her. In the weeks leading up to the concert, Clara faced challenges that tested her resolve. A major donor pulled out, citing budget cuts, forcing her to scramble for funding. A tech glitch during a rehearsal crashed the live stream, leaving her team frantic. Worst of all was the pressure on her students, many of whom had never performed for an audience, let alone a global one. Clara saw their fear, their trembling hands, and remembered her own terror at 12 facing the Chicago Cultural Center's crowd. She held extra rehearsals sitting with kids like Aisha, a Syrian refugee who played violin with a ferocity that belied her quiet demeanor, and Diego, a foster kid whose drum solos were pure joy. "You don't have to be perfect," she told them. "Just be you. The music will do the rest." Her words weren't just for them. They were a reminder to herself, a way to quiet the doubts that still crept in. The night of the concert, Symphony Center buzzed with energy. The hall was packed, donors in tuxedos mingling with kids in Academy t-shirts, their families beaming from the balcony. Backstage, Clara adjusted her black gown, the Stradivarius cradled in her arms. Sarah hugged her tightly. "Your dad would be proud," she whispered. Clara smiled, her nerves steadying. The live stream began, screens flashing to students in packed auditoriums worldwide. Clara opened with Lullaby for Dawn, her father's private piece, its notes a quiet tribute to her parents. The audience leaned in, the melody's simplicity cutting through the hall's grandeur. Then came the student performances. Aisha's violin soared in Damascus. Diego's drums thundered in Chicago. A Nairobi choir sang in Swahili. Clara watched from the wings, tears prickling her eyes. These kids, once invisible, like she'd been, were now heard by millions. When Clara took the stage for Dreams Over the Horizon, she paused, microphone in hand, to tell her story. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of 16 years. "I was 9, hungry and alone when I walked into a hotel and played for a sandwich," she began. "I'd lost everything, my parents, my home, my name. But music gave me a way back. It wasn't just notes. It was hope, a language that said I wasn't forgotten." She spoke of the streets, the cold, the fear, but also the buskers who'd shared their songs, the kids at the academy who'd taught her as much as she'd taught them. "Every child deserves a chance to be heard," she said. "Music isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline." The crowd was silent, some wiping tears, others nodding. Clara lifted her bow, and Dreams Over the Horizon began its melody, weaving the world's voices into one. The piece ended with a single resonant note, a call to dream beyond the present. The concert was a triumph, raising $5 million for the Academy's global expansion. Clara announced a new foundation, the Thompson Legacy Fund, to build music schools in underserved communities worldwide. Its mission was clear: no child with talent should be lost to poverty or neglect. The live stream reached over 50 million viewers, trending on social media with hashtags like #HarmonyInHope and #ClaraThompson. But for Clara, the real victory was in the faces of her students, their pride as they took their bows. After the concert, she hosted a reception at the Academy's Pilsen headquarters, where kids swapped stories with guest artists, their laughter filling the air. Jamal, now 18, and headed to Juilliard, pulled Clara aside. "You changed my life," he said, his voice thick. Clara hugged him, thinking of the boy who'd once doubted her. "You changed mine too," she replied. 2 weeks later, Clara returned to the Grand Sterling Hotel, the place where her journey had pivoted. The ballroom's chandelier still glittered. The Stradivarius cello still stood on its stage. She'd been invited to play a private event, a thank you for donors who'd supported the concert. Clara chose Dreams Over the Horizon, but this time she invited her students to join her. Aisha, Diego, and a dozen others played alongside her, their instruments a chorus of possibility. As the final note faded, Clara spoke to the crowd, her voice clear. 16 years ago, I was a kid begging to play here. I learned that music can open doors, but only if we open them for others. Every child has a story, a talent, a dream. Our job is to listen, to give them a chance to shine. The lesson was simple, but profound. Music is a universal language that transcends circumstance, a tool for healing and connection. Clara's life showed that resilience fueled by passion and compassion could transform pain into purpose. She urged the audience to support arts education, to believe in kids the world overlooks, to see potential where others see nothing. I was that kid, she said. So are millions more. Help them find their music. The room stood applauding, but Clara's eyes were on her students, their faces alight with pride. As she left the stage, she touched the Stradivarius, feeling her father's presence. The girl who'd once played for survival was now playing for a world where no child would be forgotten, where every note was a step toward a brighter future.